Uh, yeah. Hi everyone. So today we'll continue with our lectures. I'm Arpit. I am your TA for this first NPTEL course, I think biology. So today we are at live session 7. Before we start, here are some important links as always. The first is the link to the live session. The second is the YouTube link for where all the recordings of this sessions are uploaded. And then third is the Google Drive, where all the PDF of all these PPT or slides that I'm using are uploaded. So uh, this week we talked about evolution. So we'll start with the introduction to evolution, which was in lecture 34. So broadly, there have been two views on the history of life, uh, broadly saying. So the first thing is that it's called special creation or specialist or creationism. Basically, uh, the belief that someone basically created all the species and all of life that is present on Earth, right? So this view basically is has certain characteristics such as uh, people think that species do not change, and each species is separate and independently created by someone, and the Earth and life on Earth are pretty young, right? Uh, Young in the sense of time, right? The second view on history of life is the view of evolution, which is also called as descent with modification. So basically, the main idea here is that species change over time and new life forms form from older life forms that are present on the Earth. So yeah, and the third most interesting thing is that this view basically agrees that Earth and life are pretty old. So life was probably found somewhere around 3.5 billion years old. And so the second idea, the idea of descent with modification or evolution, was come up. So these two gentlemen came up with the idea. So as we all know, Charles Darwin and also Alfred Russel Wallace, who came up with uh, the same idea around the same time as Darwin. It's just that Darwin published it first. So this is example of a not example. This is a cosmic calendar. What it shows is basically it basically compresses all the time since the Big Bang into a single calendar, right? So into a single year. So let's say Big Bang happened in January 1st, which is midnight of New Year, let's say. Then by March, we have Milky Way forming. By August, we have Sun and the Earth and all those things forming, all the planets, right? Then in September, we have the first cells to evolve on Earth. In November, we have first multicellular organisms on Earth. And in December, so first multicellular and unicellular organisms were mostly, uh, might mostly be anaerobic or something else, because in December 1st, oxygen is more dominant in the atmosphere. Then we have other events such as the Cambrian explosion, where a lot of species um, basically, uh, what do you say? So fossil of a lot of species is found from this region, very diverse fossils, showing that like a lot of the what do you say, evolution happened in a quick span of time, right? And then as such, we have dinosaurs, the first bird, and so on. In this calendar, the thing to note is that on December 31st at 10 o'clock in the morning, apes appear for the first time, and at 9 o'clock, 9:30, somewhere close to 9:30, the first humans start walking upright. Then we have Homo erectus at 10:48, and basically the Great Pyramids are being constructed at 11:59. Then midnight is basically now, right? So everything that has happened since the construction of the pyramids till now can be included in this 1 second time frame. So that's how large these billions of years are. It's a way of basically visualizing this easily. So there's an important uh, point here. Basically, evolution is descent with modification. So basically, evolution is one ancestral uh, animal or species diverging or getting modified slowly with time to give rise to different, many different kinds of animals or species. Right. For example, we had an ancestor tetrapod. So tetrapod is basically it has four legs, which might have looked or felt somewhat more like a lizard, but slowly that diverged, and that ancestral tetrapod, basically by the process of adding of different changes in the population, by basically modification to the genetics of the population, what happens is over time this species has evolved. So different populations of this species has evolved into different species altogether. Whales, which basically, so once this ancestral tetrapod went into the water, they uh, went and became whales. Then on land, they gave rise to humans, lizards, and also birds. Right. The important distinction is that change over time is not always biological evolution. So, for example, this tree going through different seasons and the leaves coming and going off is not exactly evolution, because this is not so. Evolution is basically also includes some part of descent. So basically, a lineage is formed by basically your progeny, the genes or the traits that are basically changing or getting uh, acquired are basically passed on hereditarily, inherited by the offsprings or progeny. Great. So to make it more clearer, we'll look at some examples. So which of the following are not evolutionary changes? A monkey learns to steal food from your house. So that's not evolutionary change as such, because that's just one monkey learning it. It's not inherited by other monkeys naturally, right? Innately. A young man starts lifting weights and builds up his biceps. Again, this is not descent with modification. There's no descent that's coming into part here. The third is a plant that is prone to make a bonsai. Again, this is not evolutionary change, because if you take a seed of the plant and basically uh, plant it again, it will not become a bonsai. It will become the normal tree if you don't prune it properly. Right. So basically, these three things, there's no hereditary or inheritance component to it. There's no basically, what do you say, even if you get another uh, seed from the same bonsai, it will not grow up to be the same way. Right. So it's not a trait that is passed on to generations. However, the last one, antibiotic resistance in bacteria, is a evolutionary change, because what happens is, let's say you have a population here of bacteria in a petri dish, you have multiple colonies, and you have multiple bacteria in these colonies, right? Let's say you have one, for simplicity, you have one colony which has multiple bacteria in it, right? Now, some of these bacteria will natively be resistant to things like tetracycline or other antibiotics, right? So now if you take these and plate them in a plate with tetracycline, then some of these would die, but some of these would survive. So the ones which are naturally resistant to it uh, would survive, and they would reproduce to basically make the population more resistant to it. So eventually we'll have more and more bacteria. Maybe we'll have as many bacteria as there were here, but now all of them would be resistant, right? So that resistance is getting evolved in this process. So they, like, it's not the initial bacteria, but the bacteria that is coming out in the later parts of later generations, which are basically resistant, right? So the next generation is basically more and more getting more and more resistant. So that is the evolutionary change. So evolutionary changes are inherited from one generation to the next, right? So now we are beaten around the bush for quite some time. Now the direct question we'll try to answer: what is evolution? So basically, evolution is descent with modification from a common ancestor, right? So let's say you have some ancestor. Basically, this way represents the passage of time. With time, basically, there are different mutations or different changes or modifications that these ancestors might have. Then let's say they separate and segregate and like settle into different regions. Then this population will undergo its own modification. This population will undergo its own modifications, and soon they might again break down into more, and this might maybe carry on to B. So we might have like species A, B, and C, all of which have a common ancestor, right? All of which have descended from a common ancestor, right? So evolution is responsible for the similarities between related organisms and the diversity of life that we see. So there are three main steps that need to, uh, three main characters that need to be met basically for evolution to happen, for evolution to be characterized. So the first thing is variation. So there needs to be some inherent variation in the population. For example, here we see beetles which are green and beetles which are brown, right? Then there needs to be, in presence of this variation, there needs to be differential reproduction. So some of these variations are more preferred, whereas other variations are less preferred, right? So the ones that are more preferred or the ones that are more better at surviving basically move on to produce more offspring, whereas the ones that are less successful produce less offspring, right? So here in this case, we can see this predation as a form of introducing this differential reproduction. So basically, what is happening is that birds are coming and trying to eat these beetles, but the ones that are brown are basically matching with the bark of the tree, and the ones that are green are basically more visible. So what's happening is more and more green ones are getting eaten up, so they are not able to reproduce, whereas more and more brown ones get to reproduce. Right. So there's differential reproduction of these traits based on these traits. And then basically there is something called heredity. So these traits, this color thing that we are talking about, this variation in color and all that, it should be heritable from one uh, individual to its progeny, right? So there should be some genetic basis to it, or there should be, yeah, some genetic basis to it that is inherited by the progeny. Right. Uh, because if that is not the case, then the brown ones will also produce brown and green offsprings. The green ones will also produce green and brown offsprings, right? So there must be some hereditary pathway. So brown ones must make more brown ones, and green ones must make more green ones, and so on and so forth. Right. So the trait needs to be hereditary. So that was about the first lecture. Does anyone have any questions or doubts? Okay. So we'll move on to the second lecture, which was about evidences of evolution. So just to recap what we talked about, basically evolution is descent from modification, descent with modification, and it needs these three things to happen. So first thing is variation, second is differential reproduction, and third is heredity. Right. So what are some evidences of evolution? Why are people seeing? Why do we say? How do we say? How do we know about this evolution? How do you know that species are found like this and life goes on like this? Right. So it's a very big claim. So what are the evidences that we have in support of this? So we have four kinds of evidences which we'll talk about. So the first is direct observation. So we can see smaller individuals, for example, bacteria, to we can see them evolve over time. Right, directly. So, for example, this is an example of the evolution of drug resistance in bacteria over time. So, basically, this graph shows that how many annual Okay, so let's first talk about the. So basically, in 1943, penicillin was widely used as a antibiotic against this bacterium called Staphylococcus aureus. Right. So basically, it's a pathogenic bacteria. Penicillin was used to basically get rid of it. So soon that bacteria got mm, resistant to penicillin, and eventually people started developing other antibiotics. So one such antibiotic was methicillin, which was produced to basically kill these bacteria, Staphylococcus aureus. And then what happened? Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus strains are basically pathogenic and all are also on the rise, right, over time. So that is what we see here. In the 1993, there were very few annual admissions of MRSA patients, so patients with measles, Staphylococcus aureus infections. But you see that gradually that number is increasing over the time. So more and more bacteria are becoming resistant to this bacteria, resistant to this, what do you say, uh, antibiotic, right? Because it is more and more widely used and widely prescribed. Right. So this is a direct observation where we know that these populations of bacteria have evolved uh, basically uh, antibiotic resistance. Okay. So uh, the question here is drug resistant strains of bacteria have evolved through natural selection, but the question is how? The real question is how. So as I showed you before, what happens is we'll have bacteria. Some of them will be inherently resistant to some drugs, some of them will be inherently resistant to some other drugs because they are slightly different in their genetic makeup each of these bacteria. And because of that, they have certain variations or certain differences in which, in the way they carry out their metabolism, right? So, what might happen is there might be some antibiotic, let's say, which basically uh, damages plasma membrane. Right. Now, this antibiotic is also uh, not detected by the plasma membrane. So this antibiotic, as in this chemical, let's say, is not detected as in there are no binding sites on the plasma membrane. But let's say there are which some bacteria that has these binding sites just by a random chance. So they have these binding sites. So what happens now is when you basically plate this bacteria or put it in antibiotic medium, what will happen is only those few bacteria which are resistant to this antibiotic will come up and they will reproduce. And eventually you will have basically more and more such bacteria reproducing, which are all resistant to this initial antibiotic. Right. That's how bacteria evolved drug resistance. Now, the second kind of evidence of evolution that we look at is something called homology. So this is a example that you might have heard before in your classes in schools. So in schools also. So basically, what is shown here is that these are basically arms. One second. Yeah. So these are basically four limbs. Okay, four limbs of different animals. As shown, we have human, we have cat, we have whale, we have bat. Right. So all of these animals, what do you say? All of these animals evolved from a common ancestor, which had these different bones in these places, and that part is basically preserved across these animals, even though all these four limbs that they have are used for very different tasks, have evolved for very different tasks. Right. So, for example, humans use our hands for grasping and doing other things. Cats basically jump and walk. Whales basically use them as flippers, and bats use their forelimbs to fly. Right. So, even though there are these differences in how they function, even though they might look slightly different, these all parts that are colored together. Basically, this is the humerus in all four of these organisms. This is the radius, ulna, and so on and so forth. Right. So the structure of the body is somehow reflecting that all of these came from the same ancestor. Right. Otherwise, if yeah, all of these came from the same ancestor. Otherwise, why would whales have things like this? Right. Whales can just have fins like other fishes have. Right. So things like that. So this is basically a constraint of having an ancestor which had these things, but now all of these species are evolved to live in different areas, different places, do different things, and therefore their bodies have adapted or their bodies have modified to their climate, to their activity. Right. So this is called homology. So basically you have the same ancestor from which all these parts originate, but now they are used for different things. That's why they look different. In leaves also you can see homology. For example, uh, in various kinds of plants, leaves are modified to become or be used as different things. For example, the pitcher plant, the leaves are modified into pitchers, which can catch insects. In the Venus flytrap, the leaves are modified into basically jaws, which basically again catch insects. Then in poinsettia, what happens is it has bright red leaves that resemble the flower petals, to confuse pollinators and stuff like that. And then we have cactus, which has basically where the leaves have become spine so that there's no loss of water. Right. So all these leaves serve different kinds of functions to these plants, and therefore they have modified to look different. Right. But they are all made up of the same thing. They are all at the end of the day leaves. Another interesting thing is convergent evolution, where basically, even though you have different ancestry, if two species evolve to do the same thing, they basically have similar kind of features. Right. For example, here you can see this sugar glider, which is a Australian pouch mammal, which is a marsupial, which basically flies or glides from branches to branches like this. And we have the flying squirrel, which is in North America, which is a placental mammal. So these both have different ancestry, right? Marsupials are different, mammals are different. But even though these two are from different ancestry, they are doing the same thing. So what is happening is their bodies are evolved to look very similar, right? So the next kind of evidence of evolution that we have are fossil records. So basically, fossils show us evolutionary change that has occurred in various groups of organisms because we can find their bones of their ancestors, which link them to other animals. Right. So, for example, here we again see that the homology thing. If you see, this is basically the pelvic bones that are shown for all these different animals, and we can see that for uh, they are basically homologous. So these parts are identified across these animals, and you can slowly see that how even toad ungulates retain their legs, but how these common ancestor cetaceans slowly started losing their limbs, losing their legs, and slowly they evolved into basically living cetaceans that we see, such as whales and stuff. Right. So uh, to notice this animal called Pachycetus, which is basically a intermediate or not an intermediate, which is an ancestral sister species of cetaceans, right? An extinct species. So basically, what is happening is slowly the nostrils that are present in the front of the skull for ungulates. What happens is slowly in phagocytous, they start going back. In Etiocetous, it goes even more back. So these are like more immediate ancestors of whales. And in whales, we see that the nostrils have now moved to the top of the skull. Right. So this is how evolution is happening, and through fossils, we can see how animals have changed over time to become what they are. Right. So to live in these aquatic life, since whales originated from land mammals, so they have these adaptations that they have evolved over time. So adaptation is basically any change in body trait or characters that again pass over time, right? And help them adapt, help them live or survive better and reproduce better in their present climate or environment, right? So these are the adaptations that basically these animals went through for aquatic life. So the first thing is uniquely shaped tympanic bone. So the bone in the ear that protects the ear so that they can hear underwater. Then the nasal opening is far back into the skull so that water doesn't get into their face when they're swimming. Right. Then elbow, wrist, and finger bones are enclosed in a paddle-like flipper. If you see here, basically these leg feet bones have started disappearing, and they are basically, mm, what do you say, enclosed in a paddle-like flipper, which basically helps them flip, not flip, swim around. And they have a very rudimentary pelvis because they don't need that to walk anymore, right, in water. Then the next kind of evidence for evolution is biogeography. So biogeography basically deals with where plants or animals live and how they got there over time, right? Over geography, how they got to where they are, right? So Wallace and Darwin are the two people who popularized this term biogeography. So as we all know, uh, and as most of us might know, the continental drift of plates happens in the earth. So basically, we have all these different tectonic plates on the earth, which basically are moving at a very slow rate in different directions. And because of that, these land masses in the earth are forming and basically dissolving. So it is estimated that 225 million years ago, we had this one giant landmass in the middle of an ocean called Pangea. Then slowly it started dissipating into two because the plates started moving far apart. In around 150 million years ago, we had Gondwana and Laurasia. Then that slowly broke up to become different parts. And now the world as we know today has 7 continents. And basically, this is how they came to be. Right. So if we look at the distribution of marsupials, during the Jurassic period, when the Earth was like this, they were basically present in this Australia, earlier parts of Australia, South America, and so on. And they were basically connected here. And then slowly, what happened during Cretaceous period and Paleocene, these plates started moving. One became South America, one became Australia, one became Antarctica. And so, what happened? The marsupials that are present here died off, but the marsupials that are present here and here, which are in fact very closely related to each other than other mammals that are, for example, here, Australia, and here and here, right? So these marsupials have basically evolved from the same organism, from the same common ancestor, and they were earlier, basically, they separated into different land masses, and therefore they have evolved differently, right, in both these places. But they have a common ancestor going back. So why do we care about evolution? So, as it was said by the great American geneticist Theodore Dobzhansky, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So, if you want to look at any kind of biological process, biological organism, or you want to basically know what it does, how it does, why it does things, basically it all never makes sense unless you put evolution, unless you account for evolution, right? And evolution basically helps us do a lot of different things. For example, uh, developing the vaccine for COVID-19 was possible because we knew about evolution. We know how to develop a vaccine by evolution, how to basically, uh, what do you say, grow antibodies or antivenoms and things like that. how can we make those and how we can make immunogens and all those things basically. That kind of knowledge comes because of our knowledge in evolution and how microbial evolution takes place, right? Then for developing new crop variety, basically evolution gives us a way or basically a path to basically modify crops in ways that we want. For example, if you want to introduce drought resistant plants, you should grow them in more drier environments, and slowly if you make that change, you can grow plants which are more uh, what do you say, resistant to drought over time, right? So things like that, knowledge like that comes from evolution. Then it also helps us basically conserve endemic species and what do you say? Mm, yeah, because they are only present in one part of the earth, and there's a very high chance that we might it is go extinct. Then, uh, in the next lecture, we talked about the mechanisms of evolution. So basically, there are four mechanisms by which evolution occurs. So, mhm, if you look at it from a population-centered view, uh, population-centric view, evolution is basically, let's say, you have a population, right? So the idea of evolution is basically, let's say, in this population, there were different alleles, A and B, right? So some individuals have A allele, some individuals have B allele, some have AB, some have BB, and so on and so forth. So there are two alleles in this population, right? So how this allele frequency, so the number of alleles in the population, how it changes over time, right? That is basically evolution. So this change that happens over time is basically evolution. So the change in allele frequency of the population over time. Right. So all these things are just mechanisms by which this change happens. So are just mechanisms by which evolution happens. So the first is called natural selection. So natural selection is basically when there are some traits that are giving you some adaptive values, some basically, okay, we'll talk about them one by one. So basically, natural selection is basically when there is some trait that is giving you more adaptive value or helping you survive and reproduce better, right? So there is some basically advantage of having that trait. So there's a variation in traits, so there's a heritable variation in traits. For example, as we talked about before, these green and brown beetles, right? Then there's differential reproduction of these traits. So what is happening is the brown ones are not getting picked, the green ones are getting picked from the bark, right? So the brown ones obviously have an advantage. So what is happening? Because of the advantage, there is differential reproduction. And this differential reproduction is leading to more advantageous traits being selected. So even initially we had all of these different green beetles, then slowly we had fewer green beetles, and eventually they slowly disappeared. So the allele frequency in the population, so the green and brown, changes over time. So that is evolution. And this is how evolution occurs by natural selection, right? So there is some natural stressor which is causing differential reproduction of traits. For example, here we have these birds picking on these beetles, right, or predation. So in terms of natural selection, another term that we generally uh, talk about or generally uh, we get at is fitness. So basically, this differential reproduction and advantage can be put into a framework of something called Darwinian fitness. So Darwinian fitness is the ability of an individual to survive and reproduce in a given environment. Right. So that is basically the fitness. So in this case, the brown beetles have higher fitness than the green beetles because it's easier for them to survive in this environment where the birds are coming and picking them up from the brown barks of the trees. Right. So this is not to be confused with physical fitness. For example, you're going to the gym and building your body is not Darwinian fitness. Right. fitness is basically how well you are adapted to a given uh, environment. How good are you at surviving in a given environment and reproducing eventually, right? So fitness is relative. So how well an individual survives and reproduces is not like there's nothing direct to compare it with. It's just compared with other individuals of the same species. So how likely are you to not die compared to your friends or compared to your uh, group population, right? And a trait that increases an organism's fitness relative to individuals that are lacking it is called an adaptation. So basically, as we talked before, being brown is an adaptation, being green is not an adaptation. Okay, it's maladaptive because being brown helps you increase your fitness, right? And this trait increases that organism's fitness, and therefore it's called adaptation. So adaptation provides traits that provide improved function in a given environment. For example, we have these insects which basically mimic a leaf. So this is the adaptive trait as it protects them from predator because it's very difficult to know if it's actually a leaf or an insect, right? So predator basically sometimes gets mistaken and does not eat the uh, insect, right? Then there are other adaptations also, examples such as adaptations of the eucalyptus tree, for example, fire-tolerant seeds, oils which are toxic to many animals, leaves that are hanging down to avoid transpiration, and so on and so forth, because they grow in like higher altitudes, right, in more drier areas. Now, the second mechanism of mutation that we talk about is something called so the second mechanism of evolution that we'll talk about is something called mutation. So if you remember the definition I told you, which is basically the change in allele frequency over time of a population. So basically mutation is another way in which this thing happens, right? And basically there are two kinds of mutations. Mutations can be somatic or mutation in the germline. Somatic mutations are mutations that are present in your body in other cells, and mutations in the germline are basically mutations that are present in your sperms or ovum, right? So those germ cells which basically get inherited, right? So mutations are random. Sometimes they can be beneficial, sometimes they can be neutral, or sometimes they can be detrimental to the organism, right? So one example of a neutral mutation is the cat ear curl, where basically cats have this curly ear. Right. So there's a mutation that makes their ears curl, but it does not have any effect on their fitness in the given environment. Right. In the environment. Then the second thing is basically beneficial effect. So for example, if you look at the perspective of insects, so insects that grew up to be DDT resistant because DDT was being spread as a pesticide, as a miracle drug for basically killing of insects. So these insects basically uh, had a mutation which basically gave them resistance to DDT. So that mutation is beneficial for the insect, right? And examples of harmful or detrimental mutations would be lethal diseases such as Huntington disease or Marfan syndrome, which are basically caused by genetic mutations. Right. The next mechanism of evolution is something called genetic drift. So basically, this is basic random chance. So basically, for example, let's say you have a population of these different beetles, and just by chance, people are basically running, or maybe someone is running on the way, and basically they stomp on these beetles, and some of them die. And basically, that person was not wanting to kill these beetles, right? So there was nothing directing this thing. It's just a random effect. It's just a chance effect that happened. And let's say by chance, most of the population that was of this color died off. So now we have beetles which are primarily of the other color, right? So there's a change in allele frequency of the population, and that is by random chance. So this is known as genetic drift. So genetic drift happens in all populations, but the most important thing to understand is that its effect is much more larger in smaller populations than in larger populations. For example, here, since we have 6 beetles, at the end we have 4 beetles. Therefore, this change is very drastic. So the proportion is from goes from 1:1 to 3:1, right, which is very drastic. But for example, let's say we had 100 or 1,000 beetles, right? And of them, let's say 20, 30 died, right? Even then, the change in proportion that we'll get of all the alleles might not be that much, right? So the effect might not be that noticeable, but in a smaller population, in a much smaller population, the effect is much more noticeable, right? And in smaller population, it leads to many alleles getting lost. So many genes will basically randomly disappear from the population because of genetic drift. The next mechanism of evolution is something called gene flow. So basically, gene flow or migration, which is basically the movement of individuals from one place to another. For example, here we have two isolated populations of beetles, and let's say there is a way in which these populations, so this individual from this population goes here. So what happens is uh, there's gene flow. So now this individual brings gene of this color to this population, which was earlier not present here, right? And basically barriers to gene flow result in speciation. So basically now imagine that you somehow stop this pathway. You may have basically, let's say, created a barrier, a wall, or basically you created a basically there was a river or mountain forming or something, and these two populations were separated. So basically, eventually this population will reproduce among itself and basically have more and more changes incorporated and give rise to species A, and this will eventually give rise to species B because this will accumulate changes in a different way. Yeah. Then the next thing that we talk, so these are all the mechanisms of evolution that we talked about: natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, and gene flow. Right. So there's another part to evolution which is called sexual evolution. So to learn that, first we'll look at basically something called sexual dimorphism. So sexual dimorphism is when uh, two sexes of the same species have different representations, have different morphology, have different forms, right? So for example, here we can see in this beetle that the male one has a horn, the female one does not have a horn. In peacock, we see that the male peacock has a what do you say, large tail, which it uses to basically court females, and the females do not have. Neither do the females have the bright coloration that the males have. Right. Even here in fishes, we see that in swordtails, these males have these long sword-like things, but females do not have this. In lions, we see basically males have the mane and all this, and females don't have it. In some species of frogs, there's this color difference, and in spiders, for example, generally female spiders are much bigger compared to male spiders, right? So there's a size change that is also size component that is also there in sexual dimorphism, right? So sexual selection is basically uh, what do you say? Is selection that basically favors an organism's ability to obtain a mate, right? So sexual selection is basically, mm, for example, natural selection is when basically there's a predator eating males and females, irrespective of what do you say, whether they are males or females. Right? It's all just food to it. Sexual selection comes into play when basically individuals are looking for partners to meet. Right. So basically, we have a peacock and we have a peahen. And basically, uh, what do you say? The peahen is the one which is choosing who to meet with. So let's say there are 2 or 3 peacocks, right? So it's the peahen's choice of who to meet with. So all these peacocks have big bright tails, and they try to woo the female. And what happens is the one which generally has the bigger tail or the more fancier display is the one that is getting picked by the female, right? So in that case, what is happening is this these traits, these longer tails, these more fancier tails, are basically getting selected for by the female because that is the trait that is giving them the chance to basically obtain a mate, right? So sexual selection is often very powerful, and it's powerful enough to produce traits that are harmful for the survival of the individual. So what do we mean? So basically, if you look at peacocks again, this tail is basically the existence of this long tail in peacocks is basically supported by sexual selection, the theory of sexual selection. Basically, females choose males which have longer tails and so on and so forth. And that's why males with longer tails are more likely to survive or more likely to reproduce, right? But longer tails make it difficult for them to fly and run away from predators once they are caught, right? Or once they are seen. So basically, this kind of long tail is basically harmful for the survival of the individual. But even then, this male has a long tail because it wants to show off to the female that basically, yes, I can survive despite of having this harmful trait. Right. So that's the kind of logic that goes here. And basically, sexual selection is powerful enough to produce traits like this, which are harmful for the survival of the individual, but like they help them get a mate, and therefore they are preferred. Right. So, does anyone have any questions or doubts? Great. So we move on to the next lecture, which was about misconceptions about evolution. So the first thing that talked about is this image, right? So this linear thing is basically, so it's a depiction of some idea, but it's not depicted quite properly. So basically, it's not a monkey going on to become a human. It's basically showing that our ancestors were like this, and slowly we evolved to be like this. Right. So it's showing basically that mm, we had a common ancestor which looked like a monkey or which was similar to a monkey or one of the great apes, and basically slowly it diverged and stood up, started standing up, became bipedal, started using tools and so on and so forth, and became human, Homo or Homo sapiens. Right. So this is basically the actual thing that is happening is that we have this common ancestor with all the great apes, right, with the ape family, Hominidae. And basically, orangutans diverged quite early from this lineage, and then we had gorillas, and then basically, somewhere around 5 to 7 million years ago, is when humans differentiated from bonobo, chimpanzee, and these basically apes, right? So this is the idea. So there are a few misconceptions that I talked about in the lecture. So I'll try and recap them. So the first thing is, does evolution occur only slowly or gradually? Uh, Slowly or gradually. So the uh, misconception is that evolution occurs only slowly or very gradually. You can have a lot of evolution. You can have a lot of changes in population, if especially if populations have very short lifespans and there's a high selective or high selection pressure on them. So, for example, uh, growing antibiotic resistant bacteria, right, generating vaccines and so on and so forth are basically uh, processes of evolution that are happening quite rapidly compared to things like evolution of humans and so on and so forth. Okay. Uh, then the second thing is, can we as humans influence evolution of other organisms? So basically, yes, as humans, we do influence the evolution of other organisms because we live, we do things that affect other organisms. We cut forests, we make rivers, we make dams on rivers, we make reservoirs, we do all sorts of things which basically affect the evolution of other organisms indirectly. And directly, we also basically have crops and uh, animals such as dogs, which we have evolved from more fiercer breeds such as wolves, right? And for example, like plants, we even directly influence the evolution of plants, especially crops, by basically making them yield higher over the years, or making them drought resistant, and so on and so forth. Right. So we are influencing the evolution of other species, but other species also at the same time are influencing the evolution of humans. Right. So it basically goes both ways. So the way we evolved also depends on the animals that are around us. Okay. The third thing is, are humans still evolving? So, the short answer is yes, humans are still evolving. Evolution never really stops because the environment keeps changing, and of course, there are more and more individuals adapted to it better. Right. An example of this is lactose tolerance. So, what happens is milk has this uh, protein called lactase, not protein, this molecule called sorry, lactose, sugar called lactose, which basically needs a enzyme called lactase to be digested. So this lactase is produced in younger mammals, right? All mammals like humans, cows, dogs, sheep, etc. It's produced in higher quantity in younger mammals because they are feeding on the milk of their mother. But once they grow up, what happens is the activity of this lactase gene is stopped, is dysregulated in adults. Right. The same thing happens for humans. So that's why if you basically, if you or your cat or your dog, if you give them milk and all, if it's an adult, they're less likely to digest. They're more likely to have stomach troubles and all sorts of other things. That is because this gene lactase has started turning off, and basically because of that, we are not able to digest the sugar that is present in this milk. Right. So uh, now it is known that there is one third population of humans on Earth which are basically lactose tolerant. Right. So they are not intolerant to lactose. They can eat and drink milk even though they are adults. So that lactase gene is basically expressed in adulthood also. So this is a evolution, this is a mutation that is happening, and this is an evolution that is happening because we as humans don't stop drinking milk like other mammals which stop drinking milk once they grow up. We humans, even though we grow up, we have milk or milk substitutes such as milkshakes or coffee or tea or even other things which basically contain milk, right? So therefore, like this group of humans has basically grown to be lactose tolerant, and this has happened like let's say 10,000 years ago. Some mutation happened. So this is even though it is 10,000 years old, it's quite recent because evolution happens at a very large time scale. So yes, humans are still evolving. We see traits evolve in human populations, and slowly they're basically keep on changing the population. Right. So the next one is, do organisms become perfect through evolution? So this is a very big misconception that people have. Organisms do not become perfect. So starting from fishes, whales, monkeys to humans, evolution is not trying to make beings perfect, and we are not perfect in any sense whatsoever. So rather, evolution is basically the struggle of an organism to survive in an environment. That's all it is. And the environment changes in random ways over time, and that introduces random selection pressures, and that is what the organisms are getting adapted to. Right. So they are not basically trying to be perfect, they're just trying to fit better in the environment that they are, and the environment starts to change, and then they have to change to basically fit in the environment better. Right. There's no watchmaker or there's no uh, creation, what do you say, being out there which is uh, basically making parts of different organisms perfect and basically uh, what do you say, making them um, perfect over time. Right. It's just evolution, and there's no such thing as perfect. It's just going in some direction because the environment is changing in a certain way. Okay. So does anyone have any questions or doubts? Yes. Oh, okay. Okay. So the next lecture, we talked about human evolution. So basically, this is the timeline of evolution of life. One thing that we saw in the beginning of the week was basically the cosmic calendar. This is another visualization of the a similar thing, which shows basically how when life evolved on Earth. So basically, life evolved on Earth around 4 to 5, 3.6, 3.7 billion years ago, right? And we humans have evolved in basically 2 lakh years ago, right? 2 lakh years ago, or 0.2 million years ago. So it's not even 1 million years ago, but life evolved here in 3.6 billion years ago, right? So, uh, so these are the great apes, the genus Pongo, which contains orangutans and gorillas, and then we have Pan, which genus Pan, which contains both chimps and bonobos. So these are our closest relatives among other animals, and among them, the closest relatives that we have are chimpanzees, from whom we started diverging from independently somewhere around 5 to 7 million years ago. Right. Then so Homo sapiens, that is us, is not the only species in Homo, right? So this is basically hominidae, the great apes. But also among the great apes, we have the Homo genus, which basically contain more species like us. So we are Homo sapiens, but there are other species. For example, it all started with this. So these are all basically fossil evidence that people have got. So fossil record fossil skeletons, they're basically burial sites and so on and so forth, tool sites, tool making sites, so on and so forth. And basically their ancient DNA also they get sometimes. And based on that, they have also sequenced some of these ancient human beings, right? So by those processes, we came to know that the first, basically the initial uh, what do you say? Uh, our initial ancestors were something known as Sahelanthropus shadensis, which are basically uh, primates which initially started coming down of trees, started walking on two legs, and so on and so forth. We have the Ardipithecus and basically Panthropus. And then we have Australopithecus, which basically started properly walking on two legs. And then we have Homo genus, where we have Homo rudolfensis, habilis, ergaster, Homo erectus, and so on and so forth, which also started using tools, right? We'll talk about basically characteristics of these humans. So modern humans, as we know, have larger brain than early Homo species. They use tool, which was not seen as in early Homo species, and they are basically bipedal. So they walk on their two legs, right? So this is basically a family tree showing different groups of humans. Right. So basically, this is Ardipithecus group. Then this is Australopithecus, and this is Homo. We are this. We are Homo sapiens. We also have Homo neanderthalis, Homo denisovans, and so on and so forth. Right. And then this is called Panthropus. And this basically shows us around what time frame these all species lived in. Right. So we can see that slowly, as basically chimpanzees started, basically populations basically of these ancestors started evolving, you can see that chimpanzees have basically small brains, are quadrupedal, so they basically use four of their legs to walk, and they have these large canines and are basically frequently arboreal, so they stay on trees. Right. Then we have this Ardipithecus, where we see slowly things changing. So the brain is again small, but Ardipithecus, the teeth size has gotten smaller, and they are also found on the trees quite often, but they start walking, right? So they start exhibiting bipedal behavior. Right? Then we have Australopithecus, where the brain size starts increasing slowly, This is completely bipedal, so it starts walking on two legs, and basically sometimes it's on trees, sometimes it's on ground, right? Then we have Homo erectus, where the brain size has grown considerable, and we have small, very small canines, which are bipedal and basically rarely live on trees, which is very similar to us. The only thing is we have bigger brains, right? Bigger skulls. So bipedality. So we'll talk about all these things. Some of these things individually. So bipedality basically, uh, because early humans were not bipedal, so they were much shorter and their bones were structured in different ways. Bones, foot, and all were structured in different ways. So, for example, bipedality led to changes in the foot, hip, knee, leg, and spine. So the spine became more erect, and then basically our hands are like this, right? Our feet are, however, like this, and basically we also had feet like this. If you see on this uh, skeletons here, you can see that the feet here are also grasping. They have thumbs that are separate, right? But now in humans we see that the feet is this way, so it's all aligned. All of the fingers have gotten smaller, the sole of the feet is much larger, and so on and so forth. So all these basically changes have evolved due to bipedality. Okay. So we'll talk about what are the benefits and costs of walking upright, of having this bipedality, right? So the benefit is that it's easier to pick up fruits or food that is higher up in the trees. So you can basically pick up fruits from higher up, right? It also frees your hand to carry basically various things, right? For example, you can carry food, you can carry babies, you can carry tools, because now you're not walking on all fours. So you can carry things with two hands and basically walk on your legs, right? Now, since you are basically standing up, you can look farther. Okay? You are basically taller. You can look farther. So that allows you to basically scan the landscape. And these early humans, as we know, evolved in like Africa, where we have the savanna, which are basically large grasslands. So if you can look farther, you can basically sense danger easier, right? So that gives you some fitness advantage because now you're able to scan the landscape, right? And because you are basically standing up, you look larger and more intimidating than you are, right? Now that helps you scare away other animals and other human also sometimes, right? So the cost of being bipedal is there's lower back pain because our backs were not meant to take this much amount of weight. There are like slip disc in the spine. Then there's arthritis, and also people often have collapsed arches, right? Because of being bipedal. So we'll talk about species where bipedality slowly evolved. So we'll talk about Ardipithecus ramidus. So this was found from a fossil in Ethiopia around 4.4 million years ago. They are both bipedal and arboreal. So they walk on two legs and they climb trees. Their canines are more similar to humans than to chimps, and their pelvis is also more similar to humans than chimps. And they have a small brain, and they were not shown to use any tools. Next, we have Lucy, which is the most famous example of Australopithecus. Basically, this is also found around Ethiopia in around 3.75 million years ago. These are bipedal beings. These also have small brain and they have no tool use. Right. Mm, and their canines and pelvis are more similar to modern day humans than to chimps. Okay. So this is basically, so they got these fragments of bones and they basically made a plaster and tried displaying the bones here. Right. Next thing that evolved was bigger brains. So basically, we'll talk about the benefits and costs of having bigger brains. So the benefits are quite obvious. You can store more information, you can collect and process more information that might have taken longer for smaller brains, and basically you can solve problems, you can imagine things, you can have abstractions, you can understand concepts, theory. So this class and everything is going on because of the size of a brain that we have. If it was very small, you could not have done all of this, right? The cost is basically energy consumption. So basically, brains are around 2% of our body weight, but they consume around 20% of the body's oxygen supply and basically have 20% of blood flow, right? Because they're so much energy intensive. Right. And large brains require larger heads or larger skulls, which are basically uh, more, what do you say, which create issues during childbirth because it's more difficult to give birth because the head is quite large. Right. Uh, Next, uh, so basically, uh, people have also shown that basically, so there's a correlation. There's not a causation. They're not saying that this is why this thing happened. They're just saying that there's a correlation between climatic fluctuation and basically brain size increase in um, homogeneous. So basically, what we see is the brain volume uh, keeps on increasing, and as the climatic fluctuation keeps on increasing, right? So this makes sense in a way that if there is more climatic fluctuation, then probably you might need to, or you are probably experiencing more worse environment, and you might need to have like better adaptations, better thinking, better planning, to better strategies to basically overcome all of this. Right. That can be one thing, but it's just a correlation. It's not a causation that is shown. Right. The next thing is basically tool use. So tool use we also see in chimps and even other uh, animals and birds. So for example, here you see a chimp basically eating from a stick, eating termites on a stick. So what it does is it basically puts that stick inside the termite mound, and once there are a few termites climbing on the stick, it will take it out and start eating it. Right. Early humans, greater than 2 million years ago, had very diverse and complex set of tools that they use. For example, we have these hammer sort of things. We have these chisels sort of things, spearheads, and basically mortal pestle, and so on and so forth. Right. So even 2 million years ago, there was a diverse and complex use of tools in early humans, often made up of stone, wood, or uh, other metals. Right. So the Homo genus has all of these different species. So the Homo habilis, which was 2.5 million years ago, which was our ancestor, then Homo rudolfensis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo floresiensis, Homo neanderthalis, Denisovan, and Homo sapiens. So, of all of these sister species, we are the only species that have survived. So, the question arises, why did we only survive? And that is quite debated. That is very researched in the community. People still don't know why we survived. Maybe it was because we were better at tool use, we were better at building shelters. Maybe it's because, what do you say, we moved from place to place when other what is other species then move. Maybe it's because we killed the rest of them, or maybe it's because we interbred and they're basically assimilated in our population. Okay, so all of these things can happen. So we'll talk about these three species in detail. So these are our closest relatives in Homo genus, Homo neanderthalis or Neanderthals, and Denisovans. So Homo neanderthals and Neanderthals existed around 40,000 years ago in Eurasia, in Europe and Asia. So this is a artistic recreation of Neanderthal. So this is not an actual photo, right? So the characteristics of these Neanderthals is that they had sophisticated tool use. They used sophisticated tools. They were pretty good hunters, and they had bigger brains, much bigger brains than other Homo species. And it is known that humans and Neanderthals may have interbred. So all these kinds of things we come to know because of ancient DNA analysis. So for example, this guy Svante Pavo is credited to have decoded the genome of Neanderthals by ancient DNA processing, and he got the Nobel Prize for the same thing. And basically, analysis like that tells us that we have Neanderthal genes with us even now. So humans and Neanderthals may have interbred at certain point of time, and we have inherited both good and bad genes from Neanderthals. So here are some traits that are basically influenced by Neanderthals in human beings. So Neanderthal genes are present in humans, which cause these things. For example, skin lesions, urinary tract disorder, addiction to tobacco, and depression, increased blood coagulation, stronger immune system, severe COVID-19. So people who have certain Neanderthal genes are more prone to COVID-19 infections. So all of these traits that I mentioned, that map mentioned, look very negative. So the thing is not that all these traits are negative or they're negative. So some of these traits might be negative or maladive right now in the present climate and life, but they might have been beneficial to Neanderthals when they had it. Right. So uh, right. For example, this increased blood coagulation might have helped them better because they did not have like methods of stopping blood flow, and basically they did not have higher like more advanced medical knowledge, right? So for them, stopping blood flow, stopping blood coagulation, and all such things is much more important for them than it is to us, right? You can also artificially do that. You have the knowledge to do that artificially now. Right. So these traits are now maladaptive or not very beneficial for us, but they might have been beneficial ones for Neanderthal. That is the point. The other ancestors are Denisovans, which lived around 30,000 years ago in Asia or Siberia. There are very few fossil remains that are found. Most of the DNA that is found is from a single cave in Denisova. That's called Cave Denisova. That's why these are called Denisovans. So it is based on the DNA analysis. It is hypothesized that Tibetans may have acquired genes from Denisovans, which make them conducive for living at such high altitude. Right. So this is a timeline of key events that have happened. So agriculture or domestication happened around 12,000 years ago for human Homo sapiens, and civilizations basically started 9,000 years ago, with the first civilization being in Indus Valley in around 7,000 BC. Right. So how do scientists find this evidence? So the evidence they find through basically paleoanthropology, fossils and DNA, ancient DNA. So basically digging up earth, you find fossils of different humans, different Homo beings, and basically mm, different ancestors of humans, which tell us how they were structured, how their skeletons look, how was their DNA, how similar it is to us, how similar it is to other primates, how similar it is to other animals, and so on and so forth. And that's how we are able to place them on a tree. That's how we find the evidence, and basically all these paleontologists basically go collect these collect these bones very carefully in these sites. They dig it up and they basically get these kinds of evidence. Right. So, in summary, chimpanzees are our closest relatives. We differentiated or started differentiating from them somewhere around 7 million years ago. We are most closely related to Neanderthals and Denisovans, and modern day humans also basically interbred with all these different groups. That's why humans have both Neanderthal and some humans have Denisovan genes. Uh, by looking at fossil records and genome sequencing, we can estimate rough timelines of events, and new fossils are being discovered at a rapid rate. So basically, we have a proper timeline of how events are happening, how evolution is going on, and so on and so forth. And domestication happened as early as 10,000 to 12,000 years old. Okay, so that's it for this week. Does anyone have any questions or doubts? Okay, so we'll start with practice questions. So the first question is, the correct interpretation of the given image showing monkeys evolving into human beings is A. There is a linear transition from monkeys to humans. B. Humans were the first monkeys. C. Monkeys and humans shared a common ancestor. And D. Humans are the advanced version of the monkey lineage. So this is one of the misconceptions that we talked about. The answer here will be that monkeys and humans have a shared common ancestor, which probably looked something like this, which is very similar to a monkey. And that's why we have this image of our ancestor changing, becoming bipedal, starting two leaves, having bigger brains, and evolving to become us. Right. So basically, monkeys and humans shared a common ancestor. The second question is the rate of evolution is dependent on A. Lifespan of the organism and the selection pressure it faces. B. Environmental factors. C. Number of species present in an ecosystem. And D. Random genetic mutations. So the answer here, as we talked about before, is A. So the lifespan of an organism and the selection pressure that it has determines the rate of evolution. For example, mouse, because of its shorter lifespan, can undergo evolution faster than humans or elephants, which have a much larger lifespan, right? Because for uh, traits to be passed on to different generations, it will take basically a longer amount of time, right? And the other thing is the amount of selection pressure also determines the rate of evolution. So if there is very high selection pressure on a given organism for a given thing, for example, if you put rice in a place where basically there's a lot of drought or a lot of aridity, basically there's a higher selection pressure on that versus if you put the rice in a place where there's less drought, right? So there's higher selection pressure there, and basically that might lead to higher growth evolution over time than in the other plot, right? The third question is the first cells appeared dash years ago. So the answer here is 3.6 billion years ago. 3.6 billion years ago is when first cells evolved, first life was formed on Earth. The last dinosaurs went extinct around dash years ago. So the answer here is 65 million years ago. So the last dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago when there was an asteroid attack on Earth, which basically wiped out all these dinosaurs. The differential reproduction suggests differences in reproductive success in different A. individuals, B. population, C. environment, D. generation. The answer here is individual. So differential reproduction is differential reproduction of individuals because individuals carry these traits, right? So the differential reproductive success of these traits will manifest as differential reproductive success of individuals and not populations, environments, or generations. Right. Homologous organs suggest that these organs have A. Similar function and structure, B. Similar structure and different function, C. Similar functions and different structures, D. None of them. Okay. So the answer here will be similar structure and different function, right? Because we talked about homologous organs. We talked about how they evolved, and basically they evolved from the same common ancestor. So they have a similar kind of structure, but they have adapted to different things. That's why they look different, and therefore they have different functions because they adapted to different things. Identify what is not evolution. Resistant to COVID-19 vaccine. Yes, that is evolution. Great. Selection of an important drought-related traits in plants. Yes, that is evolution. So the first thing is evolution because you see microbe or us getting resistant to, sorry, the virus getting resistant to the vaccine, right? So the virus is evolving and basically becoming more and more resistant to the vaccine. The second case, selection of important drought-related traits in plants. So this is also evolution because we are selecting for traits that are heritable for the plant, and we are seeing how they are basically we are basically evolving the plant across time. Right. Third thing is breeding dogs for aggressiveness. This is also again an example of evolution because we are breeding these dogs and therefore we are hereditarily manipulating and making the dogs more and more aggressive by selecting aggressive parents for the dogs. The immigrating from a hot climatic region to a cold region. So this is not an example of evolution because immigrating from hot climatic to cold climatic region does not change anything. Right. That was it for today. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, if not, I'll just recap all the things that we talked about today briefly, and then I'll wait for a few more minutes and basically we'll stop if anyone comes or something. So in lecture 34, we talked about evolution. We talked about the two views of history of life, the idea of evolution. Then we talked about this cosmic calendar. Then what is evolution? Which of the following changes are evolutionary? Which of them are not? Then we talked about how we know about evolution. How do we know that evolution exists in nature? So we talked about the evidences of evolution, such as direct observation, where we see drug resistance evolve in bacteria over time. Then uh, basically homology, where we basically can track different parts to the same common ancestor, even though they are being used for different things. Similarly, for leaves, then we have convergent evolution where we see different structures, maybe because of different ancestors, have evolved into basically becoming similar because they serve the same function. Right. Then fossil records. So we have fossils that can basically help us connect um, existing animals to extinct animals and their ancestors based on their features, and we can see how these features have slowly started evolving and changing in these organisms, right? Because of fossils. Yeah, we talked about whales, we talked about adaptations for aquatic life that land mammals did have so that they are well adapted now to aquatic life. Then we talked about biogeography, how biogeography points at evolution by looking at the distribution of marsupials. And then we talked about why we care about evolution. Then we talked about mechanisms of evolution. So natural selection, how it occurs, what it is, fitness, Darwinian fitness, which is basically ability of an individual to survive or reproduce best in a given environment. Then we talked about adaptation. We talked about mutation, then effects of mutation. It can be beneficial, harmful, or neutral. Then we talked about genetic drift and random events. We talked about gene flow or migration. And then we talked about sexual dimorphism and sexual selection, how basically sexual selection influences traits. Then we talked about some misconceptions about evolution. For example, this image. We talked about the family tree. Then we talked about other misconceptions such as evolution is not always slow and gradual. Uh, uh, we humans influence evolution of other organisms, but they also influence our evolution. Humans are still evolving. For example, we talked about lactose intolerance, and then organisms are not becoming perfect through evolution. It's just random selection pressure, which is basically leading to these changes in species. Then we talked specifically about human evolution. We talked about the timeline of evolution of life. Then we talked about human evolution, the different species of humans, characteristics of humans that have been shown to evolve, and basically how they compare with our ancestors and other chimpanzees. We talked about characters such as bipedality, benefits and costs of that, Ardipithecus and Australopithecus, which were bipedal beings. Then we talked about benefits and costs of big brains, and talked about how the change in brain size is correlated to changes in climatic fluctuations. We talked about tool use, and then we talked about these three homogeneous Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. We talked about Neanderthals. We talked about traits that are influenced in us by Neanderthals. We talked about Denisovans. Then we talked about a few key events and how By the use of paleoanthropology, fossils, and DNA, scientists find this evidence and basically connect these links. Right. So that's all what we talked about. That's all for this week. Uh, Sorry. So yeah, so we'll stop here. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. I'll be online for 5 to 10 more minutes. Hey, okay. So since there are no more questions, we'll stop here and we'll pick up in next week. Thank you for attending. Hope you get in the next one also.